from having the highest number of submission wins in the UFC to beating some of the best lightweight fighters in the world like Dustin Poirier. This is why fighters are really scared of Charles Oliveira. Let's start with his submission record, because you don't just go and win 16 fights via submission. Not to mention, he also has the most finishes in the history of UFC at 19. So how has he managed that? Well, for starters, Oliveira is considered one of, if not the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter out there. There's an art to the way he grapples his opponents and makes them submit, and it all starts with his stance. You see, Oliveira doesn't stand like a traditional grappler and prefers to go with a much more upright stance. Although he does have excellent striking ability, which means he doesn't even have to rely on his grappling all the time.
Oliveira with the triangle choke. That's very tight now. That's it. There's the tap.
I mean, he literally finished one of the best fighters in the world, Michael Chandler, with a devastating left hook, which is proof enough that he's got a lot more than just submission holds in his arsenal. Regardless, there are some obvious downsides to his stance too, like the fact that it opens him up to a potential takedown. Here's the thing though, Oliveira doesn't actually mind that as much as other fighters since he's so comfortable from guard. Like, if you go back and look at some of his fights, you'll see just how good he is at turning those takedowns into an advantage. So not only do you run the risk of being butterfly swept, but there's also a chance that he'll just put you in a guillotine or anaconda choke, which again gives him the control and a submission opportunity. But wait, that's not even the best bit, because once he puts his opponents in a submission hold, he just doesn't let go. Now this is where he earns his bread and butter, because rather than setting up a single attempt and getting back up once it's failed, Oliveira keeps chaining submission attempts over and over again. Why, you ask? Well, most seasoned fighters will know some way out of a submission lock and will probably see it coming as well. But by chaining attacks together, the Brazilian forces his opponents to defend multiple things at once, which by the end leaves them with little to no energy. Now you might think that this is simple and that other fighters could replicate this in the octagon as well. However, we've got to remember that Oliveira is also really good at just absorbing blows. Seriously, a lot of his submissions come when he's been constantly punched in the face by an opponent, and yet despite being on the receiving end of an onslaught, he doesn't let up and keeps putting his opponents in tricky situations. The dude is relentless. Besides, he's also pretty well-rounded as a fighter, because even if he doesn't succeed with a submission hold, he's more than comfortable staying on the ground and grappling other fighters instead. In fact, some people say that he actually dropped to the ground on purpose during his fight against Justin Gaethje at UFC 274. Why? Well, he was trying to lure him to the ground. Oh, and yeah, he won that fight with a deadly first-round rear naked choke as well.
It's over. Fully locked in. It's over.
Oliveira's under the chin.
Oh my goodness.
Switches up the grip.
He's gonna go to sleep.
That being said, Oliveira's game is not all about grappling and submission. In fact, his kickboxing is also top-notch. Although to be fair, it's hard to usually spot that in his fights, since he doesn't use it to actually defeat opponents. Instead, he's got this super aggressive style of kickboxing that gives him a lot of forward momentum in fights, and this in turn means that his opponents barely get any breathing room in the octagon. This way, when he does eventually drop down to his ground game and holds someone in a submission lock, they're already out of breath, forcing them to tap out within seconds. Not to mention, Oliveira's got unparalleled confidence in his own ability, so much so that he makes sure everyone knows what he's all about as well.
Para mostrar que aquilo que você falou é verdade, eu posso, sou o melhor dessa categoria.
And he wanted to come here and show that he's the best of this category.
Well, you showed it tonight, sir.
After all, he's got a way with words that really lets him get under his opponent's skin. Of course, the UFC is full of some incredible trash talkers, but it takes someone real crafty to poke someone right where it hurts. And well, that's where Oliveira outshines everyone else. Take the build-up to his fight against Islam, for example. Sure, he ended up losing that bout, but that doesn't mean he didn't rattle Islam going into it. Oliveira kept telling everyone how he's a sharpshooter and how he's gonna knock Makhachev out in the first round. Not to mention, there was this whole thing about Charles potentially ducking his fight against Islam, with the big man, Khabib himself, coming out and saying that Oliveira won't show up for the fight. But where most other fighters wouldn't even dare respond to Khabib's words, the Brazilian didn't spare the eagle. Yep, he said that everyone loves talking about how tough Khabib is, but according to Oliveira, he could easily become the first man to take down the eagle. In fact, he went as far as to claim that once he beats Makhachev, he's gonna lure Khabib out of retirement and destroy him as well. Now, that whole thing obviously didn't go as planned, but still, Oliveira made waves across the UFC with those statements.
If Makhachev can pass the guard, he's got the arm triangle. Oh, this is
Besides, even though he lost his most recent bout, pros still think he's one of the best lightweights in the history of the UFC. Darren Till, for instance, recently said that Oliveira is the best lightweight on the planet right now, and he's right up there with Khabib. Likewise, Michael Bisping also thinks he's one of the GOATs of the division, because even though there are others who've held championships for longer or have done more on paper, the fact of the matter is that Oliveira has managed to overcome far tougher opposition in his career. Obviously, most people go to Khabib as the default since he retired at the top of his game and kept an unbeaten record, but for a lot of fighters like Bisping, Khabib's career was just a bit too short to make those big claims. And maybe if the Eagle had stuck around longer, then we could have seen someone like Oliveira come through the ranks to defeat him eventually. Oh, and even if you take the what-ifs out of the equation, then Oliveira still has one of the most impressive records in the UFC. After all, his stats are in a league of their own. I mean, even before you skip past his record 12 performance of the night bonuses, or 3 submissions of the night, or 3 fights of the night, you can't deny that he's been up against some of the best and has delivered when it's mattered. Like before he fought against Makhachev, the Brazilian was on an 11-fight win streak. And for context, the longest win streak record in the lightweight division is held by Khabib, who won 13 fights on the bounce. But the difference here is that Oliveira went up against some of the most accomplished fighters in the division, including Michael Chandler, Dustin Poirier, Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje, and Kevin Lee. Of course, I'm not saying Khabib faced weaker opposition, but it pales in comparison to Oliveira. What's more, he also tends to finish way more opponents than anyone else in the division. I mean, he's only ever won 3 fights via decision, with the other 30 being either submission or knockout wins. That's a 90% finishing rate, and obviously this also means that he dominates the majority of his fights and doesn't let them linger on for too long. Speaking of being dominant during fights though, some of Oliveira's wins are genuinely brutal enough to cast fear in the hearts of his opponents. I mean, I've already talked about how he made Gaethje submit in round 1, or how he knocked the soul out of Chandler with his powerful left hook. But those are just 2 of his many dominant performances over the years. The truth is that the Brazilian has made a name for himself by entering the octagon as the underdog and then coming out moments later with his opponents down on the canvas. His fight against Poirier is the perfect example of that, as everyone expected the Diamond to steamroll his way through Oliveira and finish him. The reality, however, was very different. After trading blows in the first round with both Poirier and Charles landing strikes, things took a drastic turn during round 2 when Oliveira took total control of the fight. And well, by the 3rd round, it was evident that Poirier was pretty much finished, as the Brazilian made him submit with a rear naked choke. If you want to talk some real dominance, however, then you just have to look toward his fight against Eric Wisely. Now, this was not a weak opponent by any stretch of the imagination, and yet Oliveira made him look like an absolute amateur. First, Oliveira got him in a heel hook, but when Wisely tried to slip out of it, Charles transitioned into a calf slicer submission by sticking his leg behind Wisely's knee and pulling back. And yeah, before you knew it, the poor guy was tapping out. So there you have it. From beating some of the best lightweight fighters in the world to having the highest number of submission wins in the UFC, that was why fighters are really scared of Charles Oliveira.